This story was told to me by my friend, and he's not the type to make up stories. He came back from that trip a different man, shaken to his core. And if you had seen the look in his eyes when he told me, you'd believe him too. He always loved camping alone. Some people find peace in the solitude of the woods. He set out early that morning, truck packed with his gear and rifle, ready to lose himself in the vast, empty wilderness for a few days. He hiked in about 15 miles, deep enough that no other soul would be around. Found a nice clearing, pitched his tent at the tree line, and got a fire going. Around midnight, after finishing his cooking and enjoying a little time by the fire, he went back to his tent to sleep. Then came the noise. At first, it was distant, just another sound buried beneath the chorus of the forest. Something moving, slow and deliberate. It almost sounded like a deer, but there was something wrong about it. Like it was dragging something heavy behind it. He shook it off, figured nature was doing its thing, and went back to his tent and sleep. The sound faded, and he pushed it to the back of his mind. Later that night, inside his tent, he heard it again, closer this time. The same dragging, the same heavy, deliberate steps. Hooves pressing into the earth. But this time, it stopped, dead center in the clearing. Silence. Not the normal quiet of the woods. This was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant rustling. He unzipped the tent and peered out, heart pounding. The clearing was empty. No movement. No sound. Just blackness, stretching out beyond the glow of his dying fire. Then the laughter started. It came from the trees, from all around him. A deep chuckle off to the right. A woman's giggle from the left. Then old men wheezing, high-pitched cackles, and throaty snickers. It was everywhere, surrounding him. Something primal in him screamed that this wasn't right, that he needed to leave. Now, instead, he grabbed his rifle, unzipped the tent, and fired a shot into the air. The gunshot, loud sound shattered the night, echoing through the trees. Then nothing. Just complete silence. The laughter stopped. The silence remained. Slowly, the sounds of the forest crept back in the wind, the insects, the normalcy. So, like an idiot, he stayed there even. Sometime later, deep in the night, he woke up in a cold sweat. And that's when he heard them whispering. Two voices, just outside his tent. Low, hushed, urgent. He strained to make out the words, but couldn't. His body locked up, heart hammering so hard he swore it was shaking the ground beneath him. He tightened his grip on the rifle and forced his voice to work. Hey, who's there? Silence. Then a single, quiet breath just outside the thin fabric of his tent. He nearly pulled the trigger right then and there, but before he could, something happened that made his blood freeze. A massive burst of fire roared to life in the middle of the clearing. His tent was bathed in an orange glow. He scrambled, hands shaking, to unzip it, to see what the hell was happening. And that's when he saw them. Silhouettes. This time, many of them. They stood around the flames, motionless, their dark shapes flickering in the fire's light. Just standing there, watching. That was it. He didn't think. He just fired. He wasn't aiming to anyone. Hell, he didn't even know what he was shooting at. His only thought was to make it stop, to drive back whatever nightmare had encircled him. Terror seized him. He didn't grab his pack, didn't snuff the lantern, his gear, his supplies, none of it mattered. All that mattered was getting out. His feet pounded against the earth as he tore through the forest. Only when he saw his truck did he stop, hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped his keys. He fumbled, jammed the ignition, and peeled out, leaving behind everything: his camp, his belongings, and whatever the hell had been out there with him. He never went back, never tried to retrieve his stuff, never set foot in that part of the woods again. And he sure as hell never camped alone again. He won't talk about it again. Won't speculate on what it was, what he saw, or what it all meant. That's all, he told me. And honestly, I'm scared to go camping alone in the deep woods. I needed to disappear to outrun the noise of a fractured life. My apartment, my job, the endless gray of the city, it all felt like a cage. So I packed my gear and didn't tell anyone where I was going. Some part of me hoped they'd assume I'd vanished for good. The drive to the trailhead took 4 hours. I parked my Jeep at a secluded lot near Springer Mountain, Georgia, the southern gateway to the Appalachian Trail. My plan was to hike north for 5 days, deep into the Tennessee stretch. This was the first night there. It was the second day night. I'd covered 8 miles. I set up camp in a hollow beside a creek. I remember thinking how quiet it was, no distant hum of highways, just the creak of trees and the whisper of my own breath. I fell asleep to the crackle of my dying fire. Sometime past midnight, I woke to the sound of fabric rustling, not the wind, but something brushing against my tent. My pulse roared as I unzipped the tent, my headlamp slicing the darkness. There he was. A man sat cross-legged in the dirt, 6 feet from my tent. His face gaunt. He stared at me, unblinking, like an animal caught in a trap. Then, in a seconds, as I looked over him, he was gone, crashing into the underbrush. I told myself he was just another hiker, lost or mentally frayed. Trail attracted both, but when I shone my light where he'd been, there were no dropped gear. Just nothing. So I decided to change the camping place. The map promised a clearing 13 miles north, near a place called Black Root Vale. I pushed hard, covering 7 miles the first day, 6 the next. The terrain turned jagged, slopes clawing at my knees. By the 4th evening, I reached the vale. It wasn't a clearing at all, but a boggy basin choked with mist. I pitched my tent on a rocky outcrop, too tired to care about the damp. The fire I built spat and hissed, the wood rotten. That's when I heard the voice. "Hey, you know the way to Greenwood Hollow?" The words came from the trees, raspy and low. My blood turned to ice. Greenwood Hollow. I'd never heard of it, not on any map, not in any guidebook. I grabbed my flashlight as I aimed it toward the sound. There he was again, the same man, the same tattered shirt. He flinched when the light hit him, raising a hand as if to block a blow. Then he bolted again into the woods. 13 miles. 2 days of hiking, and he'd found me. My throat tightened. This wasn't chance. I tore down my camp in minutes, leaving behind half my food in my rush to get out. I zigzagged through the woods, veering off the path, scrambling up rocky slopes, and doubling back to leave false tracks. By dawn, my legs were on fire, my water nearly gone. But I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot. My Jeep sat alone. I started the engine and drove off without looking back. I never reported it, but I swore to myself I'd never go back there alone. At the very least, I'd bring a weapon for any dangerous situation. It was the first time in my life I had ever experienced something so harrowing, the feeling of being chased, of a man following me through the wilderness. I didn't know his intentions, and out there, deep in the middle of nowhere, you can't expect anything good. We'd been coming to these woods of Appalachian Trail in western North Carolina since I was a kid that night. Me and my dad were hunting for a spot he remembered from his 20s. I was 14, old enough to know better, but young enough to still trust him. We parked in a clearing half choked by undergrowth, a stone's throw from the trail itself. Dad killed the engine, and the silence rushed in, so complete it rang in my ears. "Trust me," he said. "This place will make you feel better, so quiet and peaceful." Mom had left us 3 years earlier, but Dad still talked about her like she might come back any minute. I didn't mind. There was something thrilling about the illegality of it, the way the trees closed in around us, their branches scraping the roof like skeletal fingers. "See?" He clapped my shoulder, mistaking my unease for awe. Nobody for miles. We set up camp in the truck bed, unrolling sleeping bags and cracking open lukewarm sodas. Dad hung a battery-powered lantern from the tailgate, its jaundiced glow barely reaching the tree line. We sat there for maybe an hour, talking with each other. I kept noticing movement out of the corner of my eye. Though we heard, a twig snapped. We both froze. The sound hadn't come from the truck. It came from the woods, a crisp, deliberate crack. Dad's flashlight leapt to his hand, its beam skittering over ferns and birch trunks. "Probably a deer," he muttered. We ate in silence after that. The forest seemed to lean closer, breathing through the trees. I counted the seconds between rustles, trying to ignore the prickling at the back of my neck. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement near a cluster. Not the sway of branches, but something vertical, something still. "Dad," he followed my stare. The flashlight trembled as he raised it. The beam landed on a man. He stood 10 yards away, rigid as a fence post, face half-turned from the light. His clothes were a collage of stains, mud, mildew, something darker. But it was his head that stopped my heart. His skin wasn't skin. It was a mask of scars, glossy and rippled, as if someone had dipped him in wax and let it harden mid-drip. His nose was a gnarled knot of tissue, his lips fused into a lipless slit. One eye sat lower than the other, the lid sagging like melted cheese. The other socket was a hollow pit. The man didn't blink. His good eye locked onto mine, and in that moment, my dad shouted on me, "Get in!" My dad didn't say a word. He just started the engine, gripped my arm, and whispered, "Stay quiet." Now, the truck lurched backward, tires spinning in the mud. For one awful second, I thought we were stuck. The man stood behind few feet away. I pressed my face to the rear window, watching as he faded into the darkness until the trees swallowed him completely. Dad didn't speak until dawn. We'd driven until the gas gauge neared empty, finally stopping at a gas station outside. The clerk was a wisp of a man with a tobacco stain on his chin. Dad leaned on the counter, voice low. "You ever hear about folks getting hurt out there? Burns, maybe? Or accidents?" The clerk's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Saw something last night. A man. His face was messed up, like he'd been in a fire." The man behind the counter studied us for a moment and reached below the counter. Instead of speaking, he slapped a yellowed newspaper clipping in front of us. It told of an explosion near the camping grounds 2 years ago. The photo showed the aftermath. "Some folks camping near the trail got caught in it," the man said. "Burned alive in their tents. They found a few bodies completely burned, and some only half." Dad ran a hand over his face. "The man we saw earlier, he might be connected to that explosion. And his face, oh God, that was the most terrifying moment of my life. That night, in the middle of nowhere, with no one else around, we saw something we were never meant to see. It was the first time we had ever felt true horror. That camping area left us with a bad experience, and we never went back. Even after all these years, I still can't forget his face." The Appalachian Mountains in late autumn were a tapestry of fading gold and brittle brown, the air sharp with the scent of pine and decay. My father and I had a tradition to camp in the Appalachian Mountains every October, since I was 12, a tradition born of his love for the solitude of the deep ridges and my budding fascination with the untamed. That year was 2001. I was 16, old enough to carry my own pack. We had set up camp in a hollow near a creek, a place my father called the old kind of quiet. It was on our third night, deep in the backcountry, where the trails frayed into nothing, that we heard the scream. We had been sitting by the fire when the sound tore through the night, a raw, jagged wail that didn't belong to any animal I knew. It was human, but warped by terror, the kind of noise that bypasses thought and hooks straight into the gut. My father stiffened, his hand tightening around the mug of coffee he'd been nursing. His face, usually as unreadable as the lichen-covered boulders around us, had gone pale. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped into the trees. We moved cautiously, every snapped twig beneath our boots an intrusion. The scream had come from somewhere to the east, near the creek, and as we neared the bank, a sick feeling curled in my gut. My father scanned the darkness ahead, then pointed his light downward. There, half buried in the mud, was a child's sneaker neon green, caked in filth. My breath hitched. My father glanced at me, his jaw tightening, then nodded for me to drop it. We didn't speak. In that moment, we saw a figure there. The man stepped out of the trees. He was gaunt, his denim jacket hanging loose on his frame, hair matted to his skull. In his arms, he clutched a faded plaid shirt wrapped around something lumpy. A sleeve dangled, too small to belong to an adult, the cuff dotted with cartoon dinosaurs. My breath stilled. The man's eyes met mine, wide and bloodshot, before he veered sharply and crashed back into the woods. "Wait," my father shouted, but the man was gone, swallowed by the night. We stood there, the chill of twilight settling over us. My father rubbed his beard, a habit when he was uneasy. "Could have been a lost hiker," he said, "or a hunter. Got turned around, maybe." "He had kids' clothes," I said. My father didn't answer. He stared into the gloom where the man had vanished, then checked his watch. "We need to get back." The walk to camp was silent. That night, we both felt that something was off, as if something wasn't right. Everything looked strange, the scream we heard, the child's clothes he was carrying. It all felt unsettling, like something had happened. We didn't sleep that night, just waiting for morning to come. It wasn't until the next morning that we learned about Jesse Lee. We had broken camp early, the sky leaden with the promise of rain, and made for the ranger station near the trailhead. A crowd had gathered, volunteers in neon vests, trucks with searchlights mounted on roofs. A woman sat on the station steps, her face buried in her hands, a photo of a grinning boy clutched in her fist. Jesse Lee, 6 years old. Last seen wearing green sneakers and a blue shirt. My father approached a ranger. We told them about the man, the clothes, the sneaker I had found. The ranger, a grizzled man with eyes like flint, took notes but said little. Later, we learned others had seen the man too, a drifter, they said, squatting in an abandoned hunting cabin up near Thunderhead Peak. By then, the search had shifted, dogs and helicopters combing the ridges. But the cabin was empty. The only traces, a fire pit full of ash and a handful of candy wrappers. Jesse Lee was never found. Years later, I still dream about those woods. A silence that wasn't really silence at all. My father died in 2013, his ashes scattered in the same hollow where we had camped. But I have gone back every autumn, as if the mountains might finally cough up their secrets. Once, in 2015, I met a retired ranger at a diner in Bryson City. Over bitter coffee, he told me about the unsolved cases, campers who vanished, children who wandered off and left no trail. "The Appalachians eat people," he said, stirring sugar into his cup. "Always have. But that boy, that one, sticks. The Appalachians hold its stories buried under leaves and stone. But on quiet nights, when the wind rushes through the trees, I still hear that scream, endless, haunting, impossible to forget. I wonder if Jesse Lee hears it too.